Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 319. I'm the host Kyle Anzalone. Today joined by co-host Connor Freeman. Connor, how you doing?
Doing great, Kyle. How are you?
Doing very well, Connor. Happy to have you back today to talk about Iran nuclear deal stuff, developments in the assassination of Darya Dugina, and other really important news stories dealing with Russia, China, and things happening all over the world. Because you've been doing a great job writing news stories for us at the Libertarian Institute and antiwar.com as well. So just want for listeners of the show to know to definitely follow Connor on his Twitter account, Freeman's Mind 96. That way you're getting all the work that he's putting out, including the articles that he's writing for various outlets now and even news pieces, not just op-eds. So Connor, you're doing great work. Happy to have you back on today. Just remind people they can find the show at the Libertarian Institute on the blog at antiwar.com, YouTube, Rumble, or Odyssey for the video version of the show. Just make sure you're subscribed to the show somewhere. That way you're going to get every episode. If you're subscribed on YouTube, you're definitely going to have to hit the notification bell in order to get any kind of alert that there's a new episode of the show out. And people could support the show and help us out, grow our show, have more money to do more things with by doing your CBD shopping at Paloma Verde. PalomaVerdeCBD.com. Promo code PEACE. Great selection of high quality CBD products. Connor, what do you like from Paloma Verde?
I'm still loving the full spectrum oil. I'm gonna have to replenish here pretty soon. That's terrific. Really, the sleep is way improved. And as I said, it's just as I always say, it's great for anything you got going on, inflammation. If you're, recovering from some exercise you've been doing, got any kind of stress going on, or pain. I really like the soft gels as well. And you take those, they'll hit you in like 30 minutes after a meal, and they're full spectrum. So whatever you're dealing with, it's going to hit it. The gummy bears are delicious, and those will hit you instantly. And they're slightly smaller dosage, so it's a little bit, it's better thing to take with you on the go. And I also like the doggy treats because my dog really does respond well to them. It makes everything on her joints a lot easier as she gets older, just walking around. And you are, depending on where you live in a noisy area. Dogs always get stressed, and this stuff really does seem to help.
All right. Thanks, Connor. Paloma Verde, CBD.com. Promo code PEACE. That will get you 20% off when you check out, and it'll get the show a kit bag. So it's a great way to help out yourself and help out your favorite podcast. All right, Connor, let's get into it. And I have one article to talk about today before I hand it over to you to update us on the Iran deal stuff. And this is my latest piece at the Libertarian Institute on what's happening with the Afghans who were either evacuated from the U.S. or those who formerly worked for the U.S. government. This is something I've been trying to cover at the Libertarian Institute because it doesn't seem to get a lot of attention, but there's thousands of Afghans that are just stuck random places in the world because they got out during the evacuation in Kabul, but for whatever reason, I think a lot of it is just inefficiencies within the U.S. government bureaucracy. A full year later, are living in essential prisons, waiting to get out. So I write the article titled here, Promises to Afghans Go Unfulfilled 1 year after Kabul evacuation. Last August, America ended its 20-year military occupation of Afghanistan. During the waiting days of the Afghan war, the U.S. and its allies evacuated more than 100,000 Afghans. A year later, thousands of refugees languish in camps run by the United States and its partners worldwide. Still, tens of thousands of people remain in Afghanistan who aided the nation-building effort and are seeking Washington's approval to come to the U.S. In the UAE and Kosovo, thousands of Afghan migrants are stranded in camps that residents call prisons. And we've talked about this on past episodes of the show, particularly with those two camps. It's Laya in Kosovo and Humanitarian City in the UAE. Those Afghans were evacuated by the U.S. military, but have not received permission to enter the U.S. Camp Laya, the facility in Kosovo, was scheduled to close this week, but the U.S. has scrapped plans to shut it. In Albania, 800 Afghans live at a hotel. Unlike other Afghans, these migrants caught private flights from Kabul. Initially, public and private funds were lined up to cover expenses as Washington has moved slowly to offer a path for the refugees to gain permanent residence. Some bills have gone unpaid. The Afghan Rescue Project now owes $2 million for housing nearly 400 migrants. The group claims the U.S. government should be responsible for the bill. The State Department said the U.S. government has no responsibility for these people, and went on to say that we are very upfront. People who were smuggled out of Afghanistan bear their own responsibility, and whoever brought them out is now on them. Although Congress has authorized $7 billion in funding to resettle Afghans, so we really have to wonder where that money is going, because it doesn't seem like very much of it is actually going to help these Afghan people who, in $7 billion is an enormous amount of money, certainly more than enough to resettle them somewhere. The White House claims to state it would not bear responsibility for Afghans who took private flights. Representative Elsa Stolkin, a Democrat, argues that the lines between public and private assistance were blurred as the people rushed aboard flights before the Taliban assumed complete control over Kabul. Stolkin worked with Albania to get Albania to accept the refugees. Some of the Afghans who traveled to Albania worked with the U.S.-built government. And so, Connor, I think there's a couple levels here, right? And not that I necessarily like Representative Stolkin. She's a pretty big hawk, but in this case, she is a Democrat arguing with a Democratic White House, basically saying that, look, if you were an Afghan citizen and a U.S. Congresswoman is helping to line up your flight, you're going to assume that that's a public service that you're engaging in. It's not necessarily fair to say, oh, well, because you chose to take a private flight, now you don't get to come to the U.S., where I'm sure a lot of these people, another person who was involved in arranging the flight Stolkin is talking about was former National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster. So, people with a lot of government credentials, former generals, things like that are highly involved. And so for the U.S. to now pretend like, oh, we're just short on money and we care about every last taxpayer dollar, and so we can't just throw money at these Afghans. This is pretty ridiculous. And also, look, the U.S. built a government in Afghanistan. It spent 20 years occupying Afghanistan, and essentially the only game in town for years and years and years was working for either the U.S. government or was working for a project that was funded by the U.S. government or a Western aid agency. And so now you have all these tens of thousands of Afghans who no longer want to live in Afghanistan because they worked for the U.S. government, because that was the way to not live in poverty for the past 20 years, who are now seeking to get out. And I do think there's probably some obligation that the U.S. government has to these people. So, that's really something to keep in mind here. Now, back to the article. Meanwhile, still seeking to leave Afghanistan are tens of thousands of people who worked for the U.S. government or Western-backed aid groups. In the past year, 66,000 Afghans have applied for humanitarian parole, and only 123 have been approved. The application costs $575, a fee that has been waived for Ukrainians but not Afghans. Imagine that, Connor. Imagine how that works out. Matt Zeller, a former CIA analyst and military veteran who co-founded the nonprofit No One Left Behind, said, "We left behind the vast majority of Afghans who are attempting to evacuate and really haven't lifted a finger to help them get to safety. At this rate, it will take over 18 years to successfully get our allies out." And look, Connor, I'm sure this former CIA analyst Zeller probably would like it if the U.S. had kept troops in Afghanistan for years and years and years. But at this point, we're looking at moving the U.S. bureaucracy a little bit faster so we could actually process these Afghans and allow some of them to leave Afghanistan, or those who are in Albania, etc., to leave. And there's just no motivation within the White House to do it. They completely forgot about the Afghans as soon as August 2021 was over. Nobody cares anymore, and so they're all suffering. I mean, I'm sure this is eventually going to happen to the Ukrainian refugees, but at this point, those are the people put on the pedestal. Those are the people who have political value to their lives, and the poor brown Afghans don't. So I wrap up here with, along with the people who supported the U.S. mission, other Afghans are waiting for the White House to fulfill promises of residency in America. Ansia Ahmadi, the widow of Zamari Ahmadi, I think that's how you say it, is still in Afghanistan. Zamiri was the target of a U.S. drone strike that killed 10 people, including 7 children. Zamiri worked for a USA group and was not connected to a militant group. This is, of course, the U.S. final drone strike in Afghanistan in August of 2021 that killed 10 people, slaughtered them. One of the things the U.S. promised in response was that it would get the family of those killed to the United States. And the wife, the widow, says, "I'm surprised we're still here. I feel like it's all just talking and no action." And so it's very understandable for Afghans to feel that way. And again, something has to be done, because there's a lot of people that are suffering here, and the U.S. bears a lot of responsibility for what has happened. All right, Connor, let's move on and talk about the Iran deal stuff. So what do you got for us?
Yeah, absolutely. So this first one is from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com from August the 28th. Iran's reply to U.S. nuclear deal response not expected before September 2nd. So before giving its reply, the Iranians are conducting a quote, careful review of the U.S. response to the EU's final proposal to revive the JCPOA. And the U.S., of course, submitted their response last week. Tehran's and this is essentially a response to Iran's response to the EU proposal. So now we're waiting for Iran's response to the Americans' response to the Iranian response to the original proposal that had been put on the table. So so we're not expecting to hear exactly what happened until at least the end of the week. Iran's state-run Noor News said that Tehran is, quote, seriously reviewing the U.S. response at an expert level and won't reply until at least September 2nd. Joseph Borrell, the EU foreign policy chief, who's leading the diplomatic campaign here from the EU to save the deal, and he's the one who, of course, put this all forward. He's described both sides' responses so far as reasonable, and he hopes the parties can reconvene in Vienna soon to sign the deal and make it official. The Qataris continue to help move things along. As Dave writes here, Qatar has also emerged as a broker between the U.S. and Iran, having hosted JCPOA talks in June. A Qatari foreign ministry official met with the Iranian chief negotiator Ali Bagheri Khani in Tehran this Saturday for talks on the JCPOA negotiations. And so while we don't know what the U.S. response actually says yet, we did discuss last week, of course, the reports that showed that Tel Aviv was very pleased with whatever it was, and that they played a huge role in influencing the response itself. And, essentially what they did was, from the report, I don't remember if it was in Axios or where, but we did a report, or we talked about it, that David written up last week, basically saying that the Americans are saying that they would not, even though Iran has dropped the demand for the IRGC to be lifted off the foreign terrorist organization blacklist, they wanted to see if they could get sanctions eased on Iranian firms that do business with the IRGC, so that those companies could still, make transactions with international firms. The Americans said no to that. They also said, again, after a U.S. official had indicated that the Iranians had dropped their demand to end the IAEA probe into the undeclared sites we've been talking about week to week, they, even though the Iranians ostensibly had dropped that demand, it appears that might not be the case now, although I have my doubts, but we'll get to that in a second. The Americans said that they would never accept that. And again, this was influenced by Israel. And then the other thing was they were looking for this grace period of 2.5 years. And originally, I think Iran wanted slightly more than 3 for international businesses that invest in Iran that if sanctions get reimposed, presumably under the next Republican administration, it may even happen sooner than that, they would like to have a grace period so that these businesses are not hit with the sanctions, at least for more than 2 years. But it appears that, well, I guess Israel is saying Iran has to stay in the deal if they want that grace period contingency. And of course, the peculiar thing about that is Iran has never left the deal because even though they've advanced their nuclear program beyond the parameters of the JCPOA, that's all been essentially permitted under Articles 26 and 36, which state that if the other sides of the deal have abrogated their responsibilities or have left their obligations unfulfilled, then Iran has the right to walk back its commitments. And of course, the Americans and the Europeans have completely fallen short. The Americans illegally left the deal, reimposed sanctions, and then the European unions never put businesses or bought Iranian oil. And they just basically ran away when they saw that they could get hit with the wrath of the Treasury Department. So Iran's responses to all this, the economic war and the Israeli attacks, has all been nonviolent, but they're still in the deal. Okay, so now we have U.S. hints to Israel's Gantz that it's preparing a military option against Iran. And this is again from Dave on the 28th. An Israeli official told Times of Israel that the U.S. hinted it is preparing a military option for Iran during a meeting in Washington with Defense Minister Benny Gantz and National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan last week. The Israeli official said that Gantz told Sullivan Israel needs the U.S. to have a credible military option against Iran. As Dave writes, the official said that Gantz received, quote, good hints that the U.S. was preparing a military option. The official didn't offer details, but said the idea of the military option that Israel wants would be to get Iran to make more concessions in negotiations. If not, the U.S. could potentially take military action against the Islamic Republic alongside Israel. And so, yeah, the Times of Israel report does not really indicate what the concessions are that Israel wants America to basically threaten, to get out of Iran by basically threatening war with them. Although we can get an idea of it by looking at some of the recent quotes by Yair Lapid, and this is going to sound very familiar to you. So he's saying, he sounds like a Democrat actually. He says, according to Lapid, a new agreement would have to include tighter supervision that would address Iran's ballistic missile program and its involvement in terrorism throughout the Middle East. We can reach such an agreement if a credible military threat is put on the table, if the Iranians realize that their defiance and deceit will exact a heavy price. This is Prime Minister of Israel, Yair Lapid, adding that the army and Mossad had received instructions from us to prepare for any scenario. Now, David Barnea, the head of the Mossad, is heading to Washington next week, and he's supposed to be the most hawkish member of the Israeli security establishment regarding Iran. As Axios reported, in closed-door classified meetings of the House and Senate Intelligence Committees, Barnea will brief lawmakers about the Israeli position on the nuclear deal. He will also meet with CIA Director Bill Burns and other Biden administration officials. All right, so here's one I wrote for the Libertarian Institute. On August 29th, Iran begins enriching uranium with new advanced centrifuge at Natanz. So Tehran has begun enriching uranium with one of three new advanced IR-6 centrifuges installed at the underground Natanz facility. According to a new report issued to member states by the UN nuclear watchdog, the IAEA, the Natanz plant is Iran's main center for enriching uranium and building centrifuges for its civilian nuclear energy program. Over the last several years, it has been the target of numerous Israeli and American sabotage attacks, some of which have caused explosions. Now, on Monday, former Mossad chief Yossi Cohen boasted that Israel carried out, quote, countless operations against Iran's nuclear program. According to the confidential IAEA report seen by Reuters, the Iranians are using the Cascade or cluster, which comprises up to 174 machines to enrich uranium to 5% purity, which is far below the 90% level, of course, needed for weapons grade, which Iran has never attempted to produce. The other two IR-6 cascades are not enriching uranium. One is undergoing a process called passivation, which paves the way for enrichment, and the other has not yet been fed any nuclear material. In June, the New York Times reported that American and Israeli intelligence were monitoring Iran's construction of a tunnel network deeper underground at Natanz. Although the Israelis attempt to spin this as Iran building a bomb, even in the article, it's remarkable. That's just most of it. If you read through it, is like the Israelis going, "They're making a bomb, they're making a bomb," and then they interview even administration officials or even like Frank McKenzie, who's a real Iran hawk and the former head of CENTCOM, going, "No, they're not." like so they admitted in that article that the whole reason they were doing this was just to avoid further Israeli sabotage attacks. Of course, one of the most notorious ones on Natanz, one of the most worst attacks, which is so indicative of American policy on Iran and Israeli interference or influence. Um, as soon as the talks in April of 21 of last year were restarted with the Rouhani government, the Hassan Rouhani government still in power, the so-called moderates in Tehran, uh, the Israelis they attacked the Natanz facility, which set off an explosion and it caused power outages and all kinds of things. So did some serious damage and obviously trying to thwart talks right at the beginning. Earlier, when the talks had been announced, they attacked a Iranian cargo ship in the Red Sea. Now, let's see. The new report, of course, comes amid recent progress in these indirect nuclear deal negotiations between Washington and Tehran, brokered by the EU. And, it's important to remember that beginning a year after the Donald Trump administration illegally withdrew from the deal, Iran only then expanded its nuclear program by building these advanced centrifuges and enriching some uranium tetrafluoride to 20%. For use in the Tehran Medical Research Reactor and some uranium hexafluoride to 60%. Iran has said it will not enrich beyond 60% purity, even if the talks fail. And so, again, this is a nonviolent response to the sanctions and the assassinations and the drone attacks and everything else that have been going on. These sabotage, these explosions at their nuclear facilities, hitting it with drones, like in Karaj last year. Now, though the JCPOA limits Iran's enrichment to 3.67%, as I said earlier, this is under Articles 26 and 36. They are within their rights here with what they're doing. Now, Iran's moves also build leverage for negotiations. Of course, they're going to have to shut down these advanced centrifuges in order to return to compliance with the JCPOA if they come to some agreement here where the U.S. agrees to lift a sufficient amount of the sanctions that have been imposed for Iran to do so and return to the deal. They have put forward an idea, Tehran, that is, that in the event that the Americans pull out again and the deal goes south, they could have at least some advanced centrifuges left in a state where they could be brought back online within a year. The arrangement would, of course, act as like an insurance policy, though it doesn't appear that concept has been accepted. And then I get into this point here about the U.S. official speaking to Reuters last week, saying again that that the Iranians, he goes, we've crossed the Rubicon. If we are closer today, it's because Iran has moved. They conceded on issues they've been holding on to from the beginning. But of course, this was just more or less the first quasi-official acknowledgement that Iran had taken the IRGC FTO blacklist issue off the table going back to June. So now they're acknowledging that. What he also said was that they said they were no longer demanding that this IAEA probe on the undeclared sites, these uranium particles that have been discovered there years back, that date back decades. They've already provided the full documentation. We've talked about this, and I believe they were ahead of schedule in terms of getting those documents to the IAEA. They cut a deal with Rafael Grossi, the IAEA chief, back in, I want to say, March. And this was supposed to be the last impediment to returning to a deal back when it really did look like they're arguably closer now, but it looked like they were closer than ever before during the Biden administration back in March. And of course, this was used as a real way to pressure Iran with the big censure that came from the Americans and the Europeans at the IAEA Board of Governors meeting, which, of course, the Russians and the Chinese opposed. But anyway, they said that they had taken this off the table. In other words, that they weren't insisting that this probe be discontinued, this inquiry, as a prerequisite for returning to the deal. But on the other hand, speaking to a news conference on Monday, Iran's President Ibrahim Raisi said that in order for the deal to succeed, the probe must end. Raisi said without settling the issue, talking about an agreement would be meaningless. Though Raisi may be playing domestic politics, U.S. sanctions, have devastated Iran's economy. You have half the population living below the poverty line, and inflation is estimated to be somewhere between 40 and 50%. So either Raisi is attempting to appear less conciliatory in the eyes of his supporters, or the U.S. official just plainly misstated Iran's position. Tehran is, of course, expected to get back here soon on their response. Now, here's another one from Dave DeCamp. U.S. tells Iran not to link IAEA inquiry on uranium traces to the nuclear deal. So the U.S. told Iran not to link the IAEA probe on the uranium particles to what they're calling reimplementation day, and because they're saying it would delay sanctions relief. And this is from an Axios report on Wednesday that cites a U.S. official. So, as Dave writes here, according to the Axios report, under the draft deal, the JCPOA will be restored through stages. One stage will be after 120 days after the U.S. and Iran sign the deal, known as Reimplementation Day. By that time, Iran is supposed to have brought its nuclear program back into the strict limits set by the JCPOA. In return, the U.S. will lift some sanctions and brief U.S. companies on doing business with Iran. The Axios report said that Iran wants the IAEA investigation into the uranium traces to be closed. There's no indication there's any proliferation risk because of the issue. And that's been clear this whole time. The U.S. officials said that linking the IAEA inquiry to the JCPOA could delay sanctions relief for Tehran, and that the U.S. conveyed this through the EU. Quote, we told the Iranians that it's up to them to solve it with the IAEA, and there's no reason to link it to reimplementation day. If Iran does that, it risks delaying the lifting of sanctions, the official said. The Axios report said that Iran and the IAEA could work out the issue during the 120-day period between signing the deal and reimplementation day, signaling that signing an agreement does not hinge on the IAEA dropping the inquiry. The U.S. official said that Washington hopes sanctions relief will be enough incentive for Iran to reduce its nuclear activity by reimplementation day, even if the issue is not solved. Well, that really depends on the Americans and how much the amount of sanctions they're willing to lift. I mean, that's the whole reason that this has still not been solved almost 2 years into Biden's administration. Now, Iran is also seeking guarantees if the U.S. withdraws from the JCPOA again. Quote, Iran is carefully reviewing the EU drafted text. We need stronger guarantees from the other party to have a sustainable deal. And this comes from the Iranian Foreign Minister Hossein Amir-Abdollahian. He said this on Wednesday. All right, so the next one is one I wrote for the Libertarian Institute. It's called Iran Presents Moscow with European Leaders Peace Initiative on Ukraine. This is pretty interesting. So Tehran presented Moscow with an unnamed European leader's proposal for a peace initiative to end the war in Ukraine. Iran's foreign minister Hossein Amir-Abdollahian confirmed on Wednesday, and this is from a report in Al Jazeera. So during a news conference in Moscow with his Russian counterpart Sergei Lavrov, Amir-Abdollahian announced that he had provided the Russians with the European leader's proposal that had been given to Raisi. Now, there are ideas to help establish, he says, there are ideas to help establish peace and stop the fighting in Ukraine. I shared these ideas with Mr. Lavrov, Amir-Abdollahian added. Now, while further details about the proposal are unknown, Iran's top diplomat said that it does deal with prisoners of war and southeastern Ukraine's Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. The Russian-controlled plant is Europe's largest, and it's been the site of constant shelling in recent weeks. Moscow blames Ukraine, of course, for the attacks, and Putin recently told his French counterpart Emmanuel Macron that the shelling could cause a large-scale catastrophe. So Vladimir Putin and Macron agreed that the UN nuclear watchdog, the IAEA, should visit the plant as soon as possible. While Ukraine accuses Russia of being behind the shelling, it's unlikely, certainly because Moscow has no reason to attack the plant and tempt a Chernobyl scenario, as they've called it, that would imperil the lives of all the ethnic Russians they're protecting in the surrounding areas. They control much of the Zaporizhzhia Oblast. So, but at any rate, and they've controlled this, plant since March. So this week, the IAEA mission arrived in Zaporizhzhia, led by Rafael Grossi. And the inspections, it looks like since I wrote this, it looks like they've been roughly completed. We saw a tweet today from Rafael Grossi saying that I think they've completed the first stage of the inspections, and he indicated that there's going to be a continued presence from now on from the agency at the plant, which I think is very good news. So, though Amir Abdollahian would not name the European leader behind the proposal, Iran's semi-official INSA news site reported that it was Macron. Mohammed Jamshidi, one of Raisi's political deputies, tweeted that Amir Abdollahian had a, quote, peace initiative and an important message from a top Western European leader. After the August 19th call between Putin and Macron regarding the plant, their first call in 3 months, the two agreed to speak about the subject again in the next few days following discussions between the technical teams and before the deployment of the mission. The Al Jazeera report added that since the war began, Tehran has repeatedly passed along messages between Moscow and Kiev. However, this is the first publicly known instance of the Iranians delivering a message from Europe. Tehran blames NATO's aggressions for provoking the war with Russia and maintains the conflict must end through dialogue. In June, a French presidency official told Reuters that Paris would like to see the U.S. return to the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, saying, quote, there is a knot that needs to be untied, if applicable, to get Iranian oil back on the market. They also wanted to see Venezuelan oil return to the market. Now, U.S. return to the deal, of course, would see sanctions lifted on Iran and would enable Europe to again purchase Iranian oil. The continent is facing soaring energy prices, as we all know, because of the American-led sanctions on Russia. And this is one of the main motivations behind EU foreign policy chief Joseph Borrell's campaign to save the deal. In fact, he even said in the Financial Times a few months back when they really started to work on this, him and the nuclear negotiator Enrique Mora, that basically he's like, yeah, previously our position was, we can kind of take it or leave it, the JCPOA. He's like, and now we really need another crude supplier. So Amir Abdollahian and Lavrov further discussed expanding trade between the two countries, as well as the ongoing negotiations, regarding the nuclear deal. Tehran is currently conducting the careful review of the U.S. response. For Russia's part, Lavrov said Russia supports reviving the nuclear deal and lifting the sanctions imposed against Iran. Additionally, the two diplomats' meetings also covered issues regarding Iraq, Yemen, Syria, and Afghanistan. And of course, there's a recent article in Foreign Affairs. It's the top story at antiwar.com today, written by Fiona Hill and Angela Stent, which cites multiple former senior U.S. officials confirming Lavrov's earlier claims that Moscow and Kiev had tentatively agreed on a workable peace deal during the bilateral talks that took place in March in Istanbul. According to the article in Foreign Affairs, the outlined terms were, quote, Russia would withdraw to its position on February 23rd when it controlled part of the Donbass region and all of Crimea. In exchange, Ukraine would promise not to seek NATO membership and instead receive security guarantees from a number of countries. That always seemed tenuous at best to me, but the fact that, we now have heard this from Lavrov and then, from the paper of record of the foreign policy blob here, citing these former senior U.S. officials, and it does seem like it's essentially a confirmation here. But of course, talks collapsed since then, largely due to Western pressure on the Ukrainians, epitomized by Boris Johnson's April 9th visit to Kiev, when speaking for the, quote, collective West. Johnson reportedly told Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, that even if Ukraine is ready to sign on some agreements and guarantees with Putin, Kiev's NATO benefactors were not. Johnson is said to have told Zelensky that the time is to, you should be pressuring Moscow and Putin, not negotiating with them. And the British readout of a subsequent call Johnson held with Macron said that while in Kiev, Johnson had urged against any negotiations with Russia. All right, now speaking of Russia, I have an article here again from the Institute that I wrote about the second suspect that the FSB has named in the assassination of Darya Dugina. So, and I'll do my best to pronounce this gentleman's name, but Moscow has identified the second suspect in the August 20th car bomb murder of Russian journalist and political scientist Darya Dugina, according to an FSB statement that was issued this Monday. So Dugina, of course, was the daughter of Alexander Dugin, the Russian nationalist and philosopher. So though speculation continues and Kiev continues to deny their involvement, the FSB previously identified their prime suspect is Natalia Vovik, a 43-year-old Ukrainian national. The Russians claim she was working with Kiev's special services and that she was a member of the Azov Battalion, of course, the infamous Ukrainian neo-Nazi National Guard unit. Now, the FSB said Vovik entered the country with her 12-year-old daughter roughly a month before the assassination. Moscow claims she rented an apartment in the housing block where Dugina resided to conduct extensive surveillance on the journalist, including following her around in a Mini Cooper with various license plates to avoid being detected. According to a report in RT, the FSB added, quote, Vovik used a car with a license plate from the Donetsk People's Republic when entering Russia, but replaced it with a Kazakhstan plate when driving in Moscow and a Ukrainian plate when crossing into Estonia. Now, Dugina and her father attended a family festival the evening she was killed with little to no security. And where Vovik and her daughter are said to have also been present. So the idea is that a bomb was planted underneath Dugin's SUV on the driver's side. Though he ultimately left the event in another vehicle while Dugina drove away in his Toyota Land Cruiser. So the bomb explodes on a highway outside Moscow. 5 minutes later, she crashes her car. She's burned beyond recognition. Vovik is said to have planted the bomb in the parking lot where the security was lax and detonated it remotely, allegedly fleeing to Estonia the following day. The FSB provided video footage of Vovik entering Russia, going into the apartment and the building where Dugina lived, driving around with various license plates on the Mini Cooper and hastily leaving the country. All right, so I just wanted to provide that background here so this will make more sense. So the second suspect named by Moscow is Bogdan Saiganenko. I'm going to call him Bogdan from now on. So he's a 44-year-old Ukrainian citizen. The FSB described him as another member of the Ukrainian, quote, sabotage and terrorist group that organized and executed the assassination. So Bogdan is alleged to have assisted Vovik in the murder by helping her build an IED, an improvised explosive device that was planted on Dugin's Toyota. He is also accused of providing her fake identification in the form of a Kazakhstani passport and a license plate that we mentioned earlier, belonging to a real person named Yulia Zaiko. Now, Bogdan is said to have entered Russia via Estonia on July 30th and left the country just a day before the murder took place. I didn't see where they said that he had fled, by the way, which is interesting because Vovik is said to have fled to Estonia. Now, the FSB provided 11 minutes of this. They did this with Vovik too, the CCTV footage. Only this is like 11 minutes, much more than they had on Vovik, ironically. And it purports to show him entering and exiting a Moscow garage where the bomb was supposedly assembled, collecting fake license plates for Vovik's car, it almost looks like a Russian FedEx or something, and driving around with her in the car, as well as entering and leaving Russia himself. There's more footage as well that they've now issued of Vovik at the festival, walking around in the parking lot and just kind of by herself, appearing to sort of be surveilling things and checking things out. Now they again are saying that she followed Dugina in the Mini Cooper, and then detonated the bomb, basically making sure that she knew. I mean, she implying that she would know that she was killing Dugina, not Dugin, and that she waited for her to actually leave so she could follow her and then blow her up on the highway. If any of this is accurate. Now, the alleged target assassination would, of course, be a major escalation in the war. Again, I don't think this is definitive evidence by any stretch, proving that Vovik or Ukrainian intelligence were responsible, but I'm going to keep track of this story, and we'll see if they name anybody else or if they have any better evidence here coming down the line. Okay. Now, here's this other one. We have Chinese strategic bombers are going to be joining the regular patrols near Taiwan as U.S. warships cross strait. This is one I wrote for the Institute on August 29th. So as American warships cross the Taiwan Strait this weekend, back to, potentially our usual monthly provocations here, the Chinese People's Liberation Army announced that the H-6K strategic bombers and aerial tankers will now participate in regular patrols near the island. The South China Morning Post reported on Monday. So on Sunday, PLA Air Force spokesman Senior Colonel Shen Jink told reporters in recent years the strategic bombers have carried out, quote, countless operations near Taiwan. Shen was speaking to the reporters in an Air Force open day. Now, these past operations they mentioned later on in the article, and we understand this. Anybody who's been reading antiwar.com for the last year or so will recognize this term. But these past operations likely he referenced were likely in the island's air defense identification zone, which is not recognized by international law and includes much of mainland China itself. Now, a country's airspace is directly above its territory, extending 12 miles off its coast, much like territorial waters extend 12 nautical miles from the coast. Now, he adds that the ADIZ for Taiwan is just huge, and there's over the ADZs in the region that were set up by the Americans in the 50s. They overlap with each other, and it's ridiculous to suggest that when the Chinese go through like the south western corner of the ADIZ that they're anywhere near the island of Taiwan. I mean, they may do it so that it makes news and that it looks intimidating or whatever or provocative, but the fact is it's very far away from the island itself. And as Peter Van Buren always points out, you have planes on the runways in mainland China that are technically violating the Taiwanese ADIZ. Now, the report describes the H-6Ks as having a combat range of more than 3,500 kilometers. That's 2,200 miles. The H-6K is designed to carry long-range CJ-20. Like I said, Shen adds that the H-6Ks, along with other fighters, reconnaissance aircraft, early warning aircraft, and aerial tankers, will continue to fulfill these missions. The report describes these H-6Ks as having a combat range of more than 3,500 kilometers. The H-6K is designed to carry long-range CJ-20 cruise missiles for attacks on land and sea targets, as well as short-range missiles like the KD-63. Shen also discussed the Yu-20 aerial tanker, the quote, refueling variant of the Y-20 transport aircraft. The Yu-20 made its debut at the Air Force Open Day. Shen said the Yu-20s were already being used in combat readiness training and would, quote, improve the long-range operational capabilities of other PLA warplanes. The first official announcement that the aerial tanker was taking part in these drills. It was spotted on a PLA patrol near Taiwan for the first time in November. So the same day, two Ticonderoga-class guided missile cruisers, the U.S. I'm not going to try and pronounce that. And the USS Chancellorsville crossed the sensitive waterway between mainland China and the island of Taiwan in what the U.S. Navy's 7th Fleet called a routine Taiwan Strait transit. The PLA said it was tracking the American warships and warned they were prepared to thwart any provocation. So during the Biden administration, it's important to remember that the U.S. military has vastly escalated its activity near China. We have troops openly deployed to Taiwan now, training the local forces for eventual war with the mainland, of course, and the U.S. Navy is sailing warships through the Taiwan Strait almost every month. Last year, Biden nearly doubled the deployments of aircraft carrier strike groups in the South China Sea over the previous year, and the U.S. flew more than 2,000 sorties of reconnaissance aircraft in the East China Sea, the South China Sea, and the Yellow Sea. And as bad as the last year the Trump administration was as far as that, the warplanes flying around in China's near abroad in these waters, that's they've more than doubled under the Biden administration. So the latest passage was the first such, quote, routine transit since House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's deliberately provocative visit to the island earlier this month. Her stunt sparked the largest military exercises around Taiwan that China's ever launched. Of course, Beijing simulated a blockade on Taiwan and fired missiles over the island for the first time. So Chinese warplanes and warships have crossed the median line, which divides the strait, almost daily since the Pelosi incident. Which is something they ordinarily would not have done. I mean, this visit by Pelosi has changed so much. There were reports that they were operating in the territorial waters of Taiwan, but that's since been retracted, and apparently it's not true. But China and of course, most of the world, including the U.S., do not recognize Taiwan and agree that it is Chinese territory. But since the Donald Trump administration, Washington has been sending increasingly, while more and more of these congressional delegations and high level officials to the island, and Beijing sees this as a major violation of the One China policy. And they recently issued that white paper that again reemphasized that they prefer peaceful reunification with the island, but they will not rule out the use of force. And they've repeatedly cautioned that U.S. intervention and support for what they call Taiwan's independence forces could lead to war with the United States. And we have, as a result of what the exercises that China launched after after Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, we have now tripled, quadrupled down on everything. We're talking about Biden's preparing to ask Congress for $1.1 billion in military aid for Taiwan, including Harpoon anti-ship missiles and air-to-air Sidewinder missiles and a massive surveillance radar contract extension that's worth more than $500 million. And then we've seen 5 delegations of U.S. officials, including the governor of my state, Doug Ducey, who's going over there to talk about, corporatism and how Taiwan should set up a semiconductor factory out here. And they are making one that's cost $12 billion, their largest semiconductor manufacturing company, which is called, I believe, this Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation. And of course, this is all just based off of the Chips and Science Act, which contains more than I think it's $280 billion overall, but $52 billion to subsidize this domestic semiconductor manufacturing. Now, here's another one I wrote with Will Porter at the Libertarian Institute. This is from August 29th. Greek surface-to-air missiles locked on Turkish F-16s, Turkey claims. So Greece's Russian-made S-300 air defense system stationed on the island of Crete locked onto Turkish fighter jets as they crossed international airspace over the Mediterranean. Turkey's defense ministry claimed amid mounting tensions with the two NATO states. The incident occurred on August 23rd, according to the Turkish statement, which came just days after Ankara leveled a similar accusation against Greek forces. Athens has disputed both alleged close calls, with a Greek defense official calling the claims fake news. Turkey's state-run Anadolu agency reported that the Turkish F-16s were performing a reconnaissance mission west of Greece's Rhodes Islands, located some 142 miles northeast of Crete, and were flying at an altitude of 10,000 feet when the radar lock occurred. Despite the hostile environment, the Turkish planes finished the mission and returned to their bases, the outlet added, citing military sources. Under NATO's rules of engagement, radar locks are deemed a hostile act, but the Greek Defense Ministry insists its, quote, S-300 missile system has never put a lock on Turkish F-16 jets. Last week, the Turks summoned Athens military attaché and filed a complaint with NATO over another disputed incident in which Greek warplanes reportedly harassed 5 Turkish F-16s flying over the eastern Mediterranean. While Ankara says its jets were participating in a NATO mission, Greece has rejected that version of events, instead claiming the Turkish craft appeared without notice to escort American B-52 bombers, which had been cleared to cross its airspace. They said that they were interfering. And according to Anadolu, Turkey gave the, quote, necessary response and warded off the Greek planes. Relations between Turkey and Greece have long been strained, nearly going to war on 3 separate occasions over the last 50 years due to competing claims to territory and resources in the Aegean Sea. Ankara has accused the Greeks of militarizing islands in the Aegean and violating limits established in peace treaties signed after World Wars I and II. In 2020, a naval standoff ensued between the NATO allies over exploratory drilling rights in Mediterranean waters, parts of which are also claimed by Cyprus. So, yeah, I mean, this is the military alliance, the sacred military alliance that's threatening to take us to nuclear war with Russia right now. So we have here my last one. This is from an article I wrote for the Institute on the 28th. This is from Haaretz. This is a report, an investigative report they did that shows that Israel Aerospace Industries was awarded spy planes contracts with Rome for over $500 million, $550 million. I think it's more like $560 million when you add this stuff up. But publicly available documents from the Italian parliament and their defense ministry show that Israel Aerospace Industries, IAI, was awarded contracts with Rome worth approximately $550 million. The deals are for special mission aircraft as well as support and ground logistics services, Haaretz reported on Sunday. And this brings the total number of spy planes Italy has purchased from IAI to 4, the newly exposed deal reveals. Last month, IAI announced it had secured a contract totaling more than $200 million for a supply of special mission aircraft to a European NATO member state without identifying the country's name. IAI still declines to discuss the identity of its customers, but this Haaretz report reveals that it is Italy. The investigation also covers another massive deal with the Italian Air Force announced by IAI in 2020. ELTA, an IAI subsidiary, modifies executive jets to make a wide variety of planes used for military intelligence, including aerial ground surveillance, maritime patrol aircraft, signals intelligence aircraft, or SIGINT aircraft, and these CAEW planes, which provide airborne early warning and control along with electronic intelligence capabilities. In 2021, Italy's defense ministry announced their intent to obtain 2 new ELTA CAEW planes. According to Haaretz, these planes are based on the Gulfstream G550 business jet, which is then modified for early warning and air control missions. It's similar to the Nahshon Etiam aircraft that serves the Israeli Air Force. And these planes are equipped with radar, advanced sensors, intelligence gathering systems, providing its operator with full situational awareness, air defense and air battle management with continuous 360-degree surveillance of all airborne and maritime threats, as IAI describes it. Defense Ministry documents contain details on the contract. This is the same deal IAI announced in July that we mentioned earlier, the $200 million deal at this British air show. It was signed in March, and it's worth, when you put everything together, $230 million. Documents also reveal that Rome's $360 million 10-year services contract with ELTA for 2020 to 2029, which was inked in May of 2020 for support logistical services associated with their spy plane fleet and its maintenance. So the 2 additional early warning aircraft will join 2 others that Israel supplied Italy as part of a huge 2011 bilateral transaction. That deal also shows that Israel provided a satellite for the Italian army, and the Israeli Air Force bought dozens of training planes from an Italian company called Leonardo. Rome's Air Force is carrying out a multi-stage procurement program, overhauling its special mission aircraft, replacing old planes, and reinforcing its spy plane fleet. The initial phase of the program is not expected to be completed until 2032. The planes are supposed to be in service until at least 2040 or even 2056. The E550 CAW is described by a former Italian Air Force commander as a sort of flying command post, which through aerial surveillance, command, and control functions is able to offer a decisive operational contribution to achieve information superiority. There are also Air Force plans approved by Italian lawmakers to buy 8 more of these Gulfstream jets and modify them for use in various special missions. Rome is reportedly buying 6 more green or unequipped jets to be converted by U.S. firms like L3Harris Technologies to, quote, carry airborne intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, and electronic warfare systems. Italy's ELTA aircraft have already joined NATO exercises and operations. According to the report, in March, one of the 2 planes was spotted on its first intelligence gathering mission for NATO in Eastern Europe. The plane flew for about 4 hours along the Romanian, Moldovan, and Ukrainian borders in a pattern most likely associated with IDing and mapping Russian forces in Ukraine. According to the Italian Air Force, in the past 2 years, the planes have flown 650 missions and have racked up a cumulative 4,362 hours of flight time.
All right, Connor, thank you for the breakdown. That's where we'll wrap up the show today. As always, everybody, just share the show if you can, at com_interest on Twitter, at Freeman-96 for Connor, at Kyle Anzalone_ for myself. Thanks, Connor.